Everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you tonight to talk about something that I think is quite fascinating, and that is the idea of phantom lovers, erotic ghosts, and other sensual specters. So, tonight's talk is going to be a kind of a sampling of one of the archetypes that we're going to be covering in my second class that I'm doing for Morbid Anatomy on archetypes of the femme fatale. And so the archetype that we're going to be looking at this evening is, of course, as I've just said, the phantom lover. And we're going to be focusing mostly on two from Western culture and one from Japan. But we're also going to be kind of doing a deep dive into a lot of the historical, anthropological, and cultural themes that infuse these things. And so hopefully we're going to see similarities across time and across culture. And I'm hoping that the variety of things that are offered up tonight will be fruitful for your own work as creatives. And if you like what you're introduced to this evening, I hope that you'll join me starting March 2nd for Femme Fatale 2. I think it's going to be a really fun class. And I just want to say one other thing, that there's a number of other classes I'll be teaching for Morbid Anatomy throughout the year that will touch on some of these other themes as well. I'm going to be doing a course on the history of fairies later in the spring, and then later in the year, a large two-part class on the history of witchcraft over the last 500 years. So a few of those things will be touched on in this talk this evening. So without further ado, on with the Phantom Lover. So I'd like to start off tonight by thinking about the idea of eros, or desire, and its relationship to the soul. And if we're thinking about sort of the foundations of this in sort of classical Western culture, we probably will think immediately of the wonderful, strange romantic story of Cupid and Psyche, or Eros and Psyche, which actually comes to us, I believe, out of the writings of the Roman writer Apuleius, but it certainly has antecedents that go back much further than that. So on the screen here, I have an image by the wonderful Kinuko Y. Craft from her illustrated a take on the story of Cupid and Psyche that came out a few years ago, showing Psyche reaching up for Eros as he flies away from her. And if we're thinking about sort of the meaning of these names, Psyche goes back to the Greek word psyche, which actually means breath. And so there's a strong connection in the classical culture, but also in the Hebraic culture, and certainly in other cultures of the world as well, between the idea of human breath and that more insubstantial, intangible, metaphysical component of the human being, namely the soul. So certainly in the Greco-Roman tradition, this idea of psyche, soul, breath, that ineffable part of the self is contained in this idea. So I also just want to read a couple of things for you. One is from Hesiod's Theogony about Eros himself. In truth, at first, chaos came to be, but next wide-bosomed earth, the ever-sure foundation of all the deathless ones, who hold the peaks of snowy Olympus and dim Tartarus in the depth of the wide path to earth, and Eros, love, fairest among the deathless gods, who unnerves the limbs and overcomes the mind and wise counsels of all gods and all men within their hearts. So within the oldest Greek texts, there is evidence that there is this idea that the first major primordial deity to come into being, at least the one that we encounter as human beings, is Eros. So desire itself. And then certainly later in Platonic and Neoplatonic literature, there is this idea that desire is the thing that basically drives all physical bodies in their motions in time, right? So another quote from a scholar who's thinking on what Virgil wrote. When Virgil wrote omnia vincit amor, love conquers all, he did not mean that our love will overcome all our obstacles. He meant that love overwhelms all of us. Love overrules our reason, blurs sagacity, overcomes the mind and wise counsels of all God and all men and women in their hearts. So there is this very, very old idea that eros, desire, no matter if you're a mortal or a spirit or a god or an animal or a plant or a planet or a star, we are all driven in our paths by this primordial force, eros. So, if we're thinking about sort of the foundations of classical Western culture, we of course have the Greco Roman, but then there's, of course, the Hebraic Christian. And in the idea of the incarnation of Christ, and it takes several centuries for the early church authorities to work out exactly what are all the components of the incarnation. But there is a similar idea that there is this primordial thing, namely logos, the word, which takes on human form in order to initiate a divine drama, right? And so by the time we get to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, this idea, which has certainly been worked out in theology, is being illustrated and given shape in the great images of the Annunciation. When the angel Gabriel appears to the Virgin Mary, who is at her studies, usually she's reading in some kind of an enclosed space, and the angel Gabriel makes the announcement to her that she is going to be the vessel for the incarnation. And so I'm showing you some images here, one by Frau Angelico and one by Roger van der Weyden, masters of the Renaissance, one in the South, one in the North, showing this idea that comes to us through Thomas Aquinas, I believe, and that is Mary conceives through her ear. The word of the Lord, she hears the word of the Lord. And so what does that actually mean? Well, it means that that's actually how Jesus comes to be in the womb of Mary. The word of the Lord enters her through her ear. And that's also this idea of how she remains a virgin, right? So in Frau Angelico's image, you can see the dove of the Holy Spirit, the paraclete coming down on the ray of light towards Mary. But interestingly enough, it's slightly different in the Roger van der Weyden piece. And that is a tiny little version of the pre-incarnate Christ, the little Christ child bearing the cross is actually coming down on the ray of light. And so throughout the centuries of Christian theology and Christian iconography, this whole idea of sort of the mechanics of the conception of the Logos, the conception of Jesus, is imaged in some very peculiar and interesting ways. So again, what does that have to do with the Phantom Lover? Well, I just want us to be thinking about how within Western culture, there are some very, very foundational concepts that we might not really even be aware of today that sort of are in kind of the bedrock of a lot of the images that are going to come later if we're thinking about human spirit interaction in the way that humans and spirits are interacting with one another in an erotic way, in a way of engendering life, in some kind of an entanglement that's going to yield the fruits of love, whether that means madness, whether that means passion, or in this case, whether that means the conception of a divine being. So let's talk a little bit about the erotic spirit and its relationship to the temptation of a holy person. So just for the sake of comparing and contrasting, because I think there's an interesting similarity here, I have an image of the temptation of the Buddha for you from a 20th century illustration, and then I'm juxtaposing that with but also a 20th century image of the temptation of Saint Anthony. So in the Buddhist tradition, and I'm sure many of you know of this, the Buddha is sitting under the bo tree, doing his meditations, awaiting his enlightenment, and he is tempted, very much in the way that Christ is tempted in the wilderness. And so this is a theme, right, in both the East and the West, of the human being who has gotten to a certain place in their intellectual and spiritual pursuits where they go off to be alone, and then the temptation occurs, right? And that temptation can take many different forms. So one of the temptations of the Buddha is the temptation of the flesh, right? So the daughters of Mara, the Lord of Death, appear, and they are presenting the Buddha with all kinds of sensual delights, the delights of their beautiful body. They're presenting him with fruits and wine, or playing beautiful music for him. And of course, in the tradition, the Buddha touches the earth, and the earth acknowledges him as, the enlightened one, and the illusions of Mara flee, right? So similarly, if you're thinking about images of the temptation of Saint Anthony in the Western tradition, Anthony is a part of that desert saint tradition that comes out of the early church, and Anthony also is tempted by all kinds of specters. But many artists in various periods of time, from Michelangelo all the way up to Felician Ropes, who we'll be looking at in a minute, really have a field day. And this is true also for those who are creating images of the Buddha going through his temptations, of all of these incredible erotic and also terrifying specters or phantoms that are coming at the holy man and trying to break his concentration, trying to get him to reach out and accept, as it were, the sort of forbidden fruit of desire. So I wanted to share that idea because I think that's really important as we think about this concept of the phantom lover, this idea of the person who is being tempted and tested. Will they pass the test? And that's an important part of many of these stories about the holy person encountering these phantom tempters. So if we're thinking back to the idea of the incarnation of Jesus, and this is also true if you think about the stories of the incarnation of the Buddha, where his mother, Queen Maya, has the dream about the white elephant, right, entering her side. In the Christian West, there is this idea that, well, if goodness and benevolence and perfection can be incarnated, then what about evil? Right? And so in the mythologies of Antichrist, or in the mythologies of a counter figure to Jesus or to other blessed figures who come to us in miraculous ways, is this idea of the evil thing that can also be born into the world. So two images that I wanted to put up for you. One comes out of this late medieval a series of stories about the birth of Merlin the magician. And so here is an image coming from France, from the 15th century, of Merlin's mother being seduced by some kind of a demon, an incubus. And depending on which of the stories you're reading in this body of literature that is often referred to as the Matter of Britain or the Matter of France, Merlin's kind of an ambiguous character because these are stories about a world that is Christian or being Christianized. But Merlin harkens back to something older, right? So there's very often this sort of bizarre, earlier pagan thing happening. And anyway, I wanted to bring that up because I think that's really interesting. And I think there's an interesting sort of juxtaposition with this idea of Rosemary's Baby. Because if you think about Ira Levin's novel and, of course, the wonderful Roman Polanski film from 1968, the idea of the counter figure, the figure countering Jesus coming into being, really is quite important if you're thinking about sort of late 20th century sort of satanic literature or literature that has to do with trying to think through a possible type of incarnation, either in a post-Christian society or in a society that has a lot of anxiety about losing its way. There's that wonderful shot that Polanski gives us where Rosemary is at the gynecologist's office and she's looking at, I think it's a Time magazine cover, and it says, "Is God dead?" So at any rate, two images for you coming out, across the centuries, sort of addressing this idea of a spiritual incarnation of evil or of something ambiguous, right? Sort of as a counter to the incarnation of Jesus. So if we're thinking about this idea of the phantom lover, so much of what we're going to be looking at, certainly in the femme fatale class, when we go a little more deeply into this, comes out of the Romantic period. It comes out of the 19th century. So it's coming out of themes where love and death in a very heightened way are deeply, deeply connected. And this is often referred to as the Liebestod. And, we tend to think of that term in Wagnerian terms, but it goes back to Goethe. It shows up over and over again. And, it has much, much deeper roots than the Romantic period, but the Romantic artists are having a field day with it. So I wanted to put a couple of images up for you because as we go through this, we're going to see how the Liebestod idea, this idea of the lovers who die violently, one lover is taken where the other is left behind, that can create a situation where a type of a phantom lover or a type of a phantom lust is generated. So two images for you. One, the death of Tristan and Isolde, a very, very popular theme in the Romantic period by I believe, a Spanish painter. And then Ari Scheffer's The Ghosts of Paolo and Francesca appear to Dante and Virgil. So Tristan and Isolde, Romeo and Juliet, the images of the lovers Paolo and Francesca that come out of Dante's Inferno. The Romantic artists are going to have a lot of fun with this, and they're going to become kind of obsessed with this. In the case of the Ghosts of Paolo and Francesca appearing in the Inferno, you have this idea of the phantom lovers flying by the observers. And so something that we're going to be looking at when we're thinking about the material culture of the phantom lover, and this is certainly going to come up if we're thinking about the images of ghosts in the Victorian period, is this idea of the billowing drapery, a very, very important element in the visual culture, in the staging of the phantom lover. And it comes right out of this period of time for sure. Part of this theme of the phantom lover is this idea of the female ghost who was a wife or a bride and who has been wronged or is returning to take care of unfinished business. And we're going to talk a little bit more about unfinished business as we go along here. And that's certainly a theme around ghosts and specters across the whole, range and breadth of human history, right? When ghosts are found in human cultures, they very often are related to this idea that the person who died has not completed what they needed to complete, or culturally speaking, those who are left behind have not performed the proper rituals or have done something to offend the deceased. So two cases in point. I thought this was fun to put up the image of Frumacera, of course, from the musical Fiddler on the Roof. This is an image from the film from 1971, where the butcher's wife appears in Tevia's dream, and she is not happy that Laser Wolf is going to be taking Tevia's daughter for her new bride, and that is staged in a very, very dramatic way, both on stage and then in the film. But likewise, there's many, many images. We're going to be talking about these things if we're thinking about the Japanese version of the wronged wife, the murdered courtesan, the female figure that is returning from the dead to wreak havoc or get revenge because of the way that she has been wronged in life. So an image by Toyokuni of one of these female ghosts that we're going to be talking a little bit more about later in the lecture here. So this idea of the vengeful ghost as the wronged wife or bride. And again, I want to just reiterate that we're looking at mostly female ghosts tonight because the phantom lover, as I am presenting it to you, is being presented in tandem with this idea that we'll explore more deeply in the class on the femme fatale. So again, thinking about the ghost as a representation of an unsolved mystery or as unfinished business. Certainly in the Victorian period, that's such a prominent theme. So an image for you, Sir John Everett Millet's incredible painting, Speak, Speak, in which a man is being awakened in the night, and at the foot of his bed, he sees this beautiful woman in white, looking almost like a bride. And then if we're thinking about this period of time, Wilkie Collins' books, The Moonstone and also The Woman in White, are bestsellers and cause sort of major sensations. So of course the Victorians are obsessed with ghosts, but they're also obsessed with this image of the beautiful woman in white And we'll talk a little bit more about her in a minute, because that ties back even further to some much older images of these very strange figures that appear, and they appear in Celtic culture, they appear in old France, and very often they're also tied into fairies. But for our purposes, particularly in thinking about the 19th century, there's so much incredible visual culture of this female specter that's used to great effect in the arts. And so another image for you here. Again, the woman in white was presented on the stage. So a beautiful poster by Frederick Walker, where she's passing through a doorway towards the stars. A similar image that's used over and over again comes from one of these other very old stories that's often known as the mistletoe bough or the bride in the chest. And it's interesting because it's actually mentioned in the Alfred Hitchcock film Rope, which I had forgotten about until I was putting this lecture together, where two gay lovers have actually murdered a young man and put him in a chest and actually serve a buffet dinner. It's quite macabre. Hitchcock's first color film. If you haven't seen it, I would urge you to see it. But this story is mentioned by one of the characters, and I hadn't thought about that until I was putting this lecture together, as I said. But it's such a horrifying story. But you find it in not only in the Victorian literature, but it goes back in a lot of the folk traditions, right? It's a kind of a very, very old urban legend in a lot of different cultures of Europe. And so what's the story? The story is that a young bride on her wedding day is playing hide and seek, and she hides in her own trousseau, and the spring lock, it gets, she's locked in the box and she can't get out, and so she suffocates and dies. And then, of course, she's not found until many, many years later. So lots of images of the mistletoe bough. And then in 1904, a very, very early silent film is done called The Mistletoe Bough, I believe. And but instead of the corpse, the ghost is actually pictured. And so, of course, in the history of early special effects, they're having a field day, of course, with the transparent figure moving across the screen. And that ties into, of course, the culture of the phantasmagoria, the magic lantern. We're going to be talking about that in a minute. But I wanted to mention the mistletoe bough because that story plays such a prominent role in so many films, in so many novels, in so many images through the last 200 years of Western cultural sort of ghost culture. If we're thinking about The Corpse Bride, of course, the wonderful film from 2005 by Tim Burton, that goes back to a much older story. And you can read about this online. One of Tim Burton's friends, it might have been the screenwriter, when he was working on The Nightmare Before Christmas, mentioned this story to him. It actually comes from a 17th century or 18th century Jewish folktale called The Finger. And that is about, of course, this idea of a human man who, through misadventure, becomes betrothed and then has to marry a corpse, right? So very often in these stories of a human person who is brought into contact, love contact, with either a reanimated corpse or some kind of a phantom, there's some kind of an error. Something occurs in which there's a misalliance, as it were, right? And even if you're thinking about the story of Romeo and Juliet, this idea of the star-crossed lovers. So there is something very deep and very mysterious in a lot of these stories where phantoms, ghosts, human beings are yoked together in this unnatural way, shall we say, right? I mean, it creates for great stories, it creates for high drama, but there's very often an event, right? Something goes awry, something goes wrong. Again, this idea of unfinished business or an error that sets the story into motion. Certainly the case here in the story of the Corpse Bride or The Finger. So I want to talk also about this idea, if we're thinking about misalliance, this idea of the phantom lover as the phantom of lust, and this idea that lust desire, eros, but particularly misplaced lust, uncontrollable lust, leads to something really kind of terrifying and horrifying. So, two images, again, sort of across cultures. Kuniyoshi's incredible image of Emma, king of hell, presiding over lovemaking among the hungry dead, right? The hungry ghosts that come out of the Buddhist tradition. And I'm going to show you some more images that come out of this whole Edo tradition in Japan of sort of erotica pornography and horror, where the sort of ghosts of lust are being pictured in these really over the top, fabulous ways. Because if you think about sort of the literature of the hungry ghost and the idea of the hells, right, of Buddhism, and you can think about this also in Dante, people who die in the throes to a particular type of lust, right, in the underworld, in hell, they continue to sort of infinitely repeat that, right? We're going to talk about the wheel of Ixion in a minute. This idea of the idea of the ghost being doomed to infinitely repeat the sin. And it's interesting because there's an image by the symbolist painter Giovanni Segantini, who's one of the strangest and most interesting of sort of the symbolist painters. And this is called the punishment of lust or the punishment of luxury. What we have to remember is that in the Western medieval and then a later romantic tradition, lust and luxury are kind of seen as the same thing. I mean, they can be teased apart, but in a lot of the iconography, luxuria is also translated as lust. So in this image, there's these two women who are sort of lying together and coming together in opposite ways, and they're sort of hovering over the earth. And Segantini actually, if you look up his work, he creates all of these very, very interesting images, which are very much tied into the idea of the sort of femme fatale, of these sort of female ghosts, these female phantoms that are kind of hovering in the wilderness, and that very often are the remnants of something very, very lustful. Very, very strange images, right? So I wanted to put those up to kind of, sort of juxtapose them, because I think there is kind of an interesting juxtaposition in the iconography of this idea of sort of like what remains when lust overtakes a human being. And even, how can we image that if it continues after death? So this idea of the lustful phantoms. So also, if we're thinking about this idea of eros and desire, which is sort of writ large in a supernatural way, um, in the classical tradition, gods and goddesses are always ravishing and carrying away human beings, right? And so, two images that I wanted to put up for you, which I think are quite interesting, and this is a theme that is artists love to play with from the Middle Ages all the way up to the symbolist period in the 19th century. The image of the god of the wind, Boreas, carrying off Orthea. And so very often he's imaged as this sort of very hunky guy with wings, coming to grab her, and there's all this fabulous sort of diaphanous fabric around her. But this idea of the human being who is being ravished by a deity, carried away by a deity, or a spirit of some kind. And you find that in in literature from all over the world, right? But if we're thinking about this idea of the phantom lover, this idea of the human being sort of being swept away, I think this myth provides a lot of just really incredible opportunity for artists. So I wanted to put these up for you. Likewise, if we're thinking about this idea of human beings being carried off by the spirits of the dead, in the Romantic period, there's some really interesting images. One is Lenore. So this is a German ballad that's written at the end of the 18th century. It makes its way to England, and then there's an absolute craze for it, in much the same way that there's kind of a craze for Goethe and, his literature of the romantic suicide, of course, Faust later on. And again, this is sort of getting into the Liebestod idea, where a young man or woman in their relationship to a very kind of romanticized idea of death is swept away. So here's some an image for you: The Ballad of Lenore or The Dead Travel Fast from 1839. And I don't know if you're a Gen Xer like me, you might remember a series that came out in the 1980s called The Enchanted World. This image, or a close up of it, was the cover of that book on ghosts. Ghosts was one of the, I think there were like 24 books in the series, and one of them was ghosts. And so this image had a very profound impact on me as a youngster, of this young woman on the back of this sort of phantom knight, and she's opening up the lid of the visor, and there's this glowing skull on the inside. So this is the image from 1839. So I wanted to point out something else that's very interesting. The Dead Travel Fast is the subtitle of this. Well, that's the epigram in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Denn die Toten reiten schnell. And I believe in the 1931 film of Dracula, that's what the old lady in the coach says to him. And I can't remember if she says it in German or if she says it in Hungarian. The dead travel fast. So keep that in mind, because we're going to look at the death coach that shows up in just a second. Another image for you from the Ballad of Lenore, this one getting a little bit more erotic, where the woman who's being carried off by this phantom lover, this dead soldier on horseback, her breasts are exposed. And of course, she's in this very diaphanous gown. So again, if we're thinking about the themes of eroticism in the Romantic period, that's a big part of, I would say, the selling point as well. Of course, it harkens back to classicism and a lot of other things, but there's also a lot of pulchritude, right? There's this sort of gorgeous, delicious young woman who's scantily clad flying through the night sky. Wanted to point out something else to you, too, if we're thinking about the 19th century. The reverse of this is the theme of the fallen warrior being carried off by the Valkyrie. And in Femme Fatale 2, one of the weeks, we're going to be focusing on the archetype of the Amazon. So we're going to be talking about supernatural women in battle, and also human women in battle, mythical women in battle, right? And so we're going to be talking a lot about the sort of tradition of the Valkyries. But just looking at these images of the Ballad of Lenore, I was quite taken by the fact that, this reminds me a lot of sort of an inversion of the Valkyrie image. Anyway, for what that's worth. Aha, the death coach. So I hope that you will all take the time to see the new version of Nosferatu. I really, really enjoyed it. I know, there's been mixed reviews on it. I love all of the different film versions of Nosferatu, of course, starting from the very beginning, from the 1922 Murnau, and then, of course, the wonderful version in the 70s, with Klaus Kinski, done by Herzog. And then I think Eggers did a really fine job with his new, very interesting, and I think very feminist take. I think the argument can be made for that. We can talk more about that another time. But I really did enjoy it. Anyway, for our purposes, again, this idea of the phantom lover, this idea of being carried away by the spirits of the dead, I wanted to bring up this idea of the phantom coach and the human being swept away by this vehicle of the spirits of death, right? So this comes up in the Disney film of 1959, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, because, of course, in the Celtic Irish tradition, there is this idea of the death coach or the silent coach. I am not going to try to pronounce the Gaelic for you, but it's there if you want to attempt it, or if you know your Gaelic. But that is shown in that film. Likewise, I think that Eggers and his team did a really incredible production of presenting us with a really terrifying, haunting, beautiful image of the Count Orlok's coach, right? So this similar idea, when one is being taken, right? Almost in the sense of the way Persephone is taken by Hades. There is some kind of a ghostly vehicle that is going to take us, right? I think that's kind of interesting. Okay, let's get back to our theme of the Phantom Lover. I think that's getting a little bit off course here, but I wanted to share that with you because I do think this idea of being swept away is very important. So we talked a little bit about the ghost of the woman, right? The sort of femme fatale woman in white figure, whether we're thinking about the Japanese, whether we're thinking about sort of the Victorian. And I wanted to just point out very quickly that there's a strong connection between the lady in white, La Dame Blanche, not just as a ghost, but also as a fairy. And if you come take my fairy class in a little later in the spring, we're going to talk a lot about this because there's a very, very deep old tradition of the interconnectedness of the fae folk, the fairy folk, with the ghosts of the dead, particularly the ancestral ghosts. And even if you're thinking about the women in white that appear and that are labeled as angels or saints, think about all of the Marian apparitions, right? Whether we're talking about Joan of Arc, whether we're talking about Fatima, there is a native tradition, particularly in northern France, of Les Dames Blanches. So, two images for you here from the 19th century of this mysterious figure, La Dame Blanche, who will appear to people very often in ruins, sometimes in caves. And she can be a benevolent figure, she can be a figure of warning. And sometimes she can also be a lover, right? If you think about the figure of Melusine, who we'll talk more about in the fairy class, this powerful female figure in white, the glowing female figure. Who is she? Who is she? And again, as I've said, she can be a fairy. Sometimes she's taken as a lover or as a wife, as in the case of Melusine. In the case of these different fairies that are very often the testers of young men in the literature. And these, of course, come out of much older, characters, these much older spirit traditions, which, of course, we find all over the world of the elementals, right? But very often there is a love relationship, sometimes with human men, sometimes with human women. That's not uncommon, for sure. Again, if we're thinking about ghostly romances in the 19th century, this idea of the phantom lover, I want to point you to a wonderful queer author, Vernon Lee, who actually was Violet Paget. Here's her portrait painted by John Singer Sargent in 1881. Her life story is quite fascinating, but she wrote a series of, she kind of comes out of the late Gothic, but also the weird literature. And so I just wanted to put up a couple of covers from different collections of her weird tales. And phantom lovers, humans having relationships to these mysterious female figures, are central to a lot of her works. And I also want to point out, too, that she was, gay. And so I think that if we're thinking about I talk more about this in the femme fatale class, but there is very often a very strong queer element to these stories. And that's certainly something that's been opened up very, very much in the last couple of decades, if we're thinking about literary studies, right? How do these stories about ghostly lovers or encounters with the otherworldly relate to the queer experience, relate to the experience of being an outsider? Very, very important to think through, and also a very, very important gateway for entering into the lives of queer people in other times and places. Because, of course, that experience changes relating to the context for how queer people can show up and how they can even show up for themselves, particularly in the works, that they create. So that having been said, I want to go back a little bit further to the 18th century. We've been bouncing around in time a lot here. I often do that in my classes. But because we're looking at kind of a large theme, this idea of the phantom lover, I want us to also be thinking about the material culture, right? So again, as I've mentioned before, in the Victorian literature, we're thinking so much about when these figures appear, there's kind of a diaphanous quality. And again, if you're looking at the literature and the images of ghosts in the Japanese, you find this in various cultures of the world, the idea of airiness, the idea of transparency, This is very often tied into images of nature spirits, of gods, or of ghosts. But for our purposes, if we're thinking about the actual sort of relationship of material culture to the way that ghosts and phantoms manifest in Western culture, we have to be thinking about the history of the phantasmagoria. We've already sort of touched a little bit on the history of cinema, but this all goes back to the magic lantern shows and, of course, to the phantasmagorias of the late 18th century and then the Victorian period. So, two things that I want to talk about very briefly are this idea of the phantom when it appears to you, um, and also in its relationship to yearning, right? Which kind of gets into this idea of sort of how our own lust, our own yearning, our own grief can cloud our minds, right? Is that thing that we're seeing an illusion or is it real? And this ties into this idea of these early slideshows, right? These early magic lantern shows. So I want to put up something for you. This is a book that came out in 1803 called Phantasmagoria, or the Development of Magical Deception. Because already there is this idea in the 19th century that when people are going to these phantasmagoria, these magic lantern shows, they are sometimes being tricked into thinking that they're actually seeing ghosts, right? And Terry Castle has written about this a lot. And then there's a book that's come out recently called Sexuality and the Gothic Magic Lantern. And it looks at this sort of matrix of material culture, the literature of sort of Gothic desire, and also actually the actual experiences of people, right? And that's how the sort of Victorian ghost gets very, very much entangled with the strangeness and the very real sort of strong experience of being at these shows, right? Where, a lot of times people knew that what they were looking at was a performance, but they perhaps didn't always, right? So this idea of and you find this later on in spiritualism too, like with the trickery at seances. Is the ghost real? Is it a deception? Another case in point, this beautiful 18th century painting on the theme of the magic lantern and the illusion of young love, where Cupid himself is sort of showing these two lovers sort of the trick, right? So again, this idea, if you're thinking about the ghost, if you're thinking about desire, and if you're thinking about the actual sort of mechanics for making ghosts appear, right? And I think you can actually pull this even to, I teach courses actually on the history of automata, the history of early robotics, this idea of when a phantom or a ghost or a replica appears to you, particularly in relationship to desire, what is the nature of its artificialness? How is that thing being created, right? Not only is it possible that it's a deception based on your own misreading of what you're seeing, it's also possible that there's somebody who is trying to trick you, right? I love this. So, part of this whole kind of entanglement of ideas of the idea of love and the magic lantern and the projection being somehow deceptive is found in things that are, as diverse as, Victorian Valentine's cards. So, this is a Valentine's card that's coming to us from the late Victorian period, and it's got a little wheel, a paper wheel that you can turn. And so, Cupid, with these little fairy wings here, is projecting an image of a heart. And as you turn the wheel, a crown can appear after the heart or a bag of money. And here's what the little poem says, the little poem on the Valentine. Come, Cupid, bring your camera and photograph my lady's heart. I want to see if gold or power or love plays the important part. So again, I wanted to put the magic lantern there because I think there's something really fascinating if we're thinking about the archetype of the phantom lover, and we're thinking about the idea of projection, and if we're thinking about how this is so entangled in the technologies of desire over the last 200 years, right? Um, how do ideas of projection, how do ideas of deception, how do these metaphors that we play with in our mind, particularly around ideas of love, get entangled with a lot of the technologies of making these things appear to us, right? So just stay with me on this. So I wanted to put this up. I think this is really interesting. So here's an image for you of the whirlwind of the lovers, and this is an illustration by William Blake for Dante's Inferno. Because if you know Dante's Inferno, one of the really strong images, and this goes back to the vision of Paolo and Francesca, who are two of the lovers in this whirlwind in the underworld. There is this idea in Dante that people who die, lovers who die in lust, think of Romeo and Juliet too, right? Their passions have overcome them to the point of where death, they've died, right? There's a literal image, or there's an image in Dante of a whirlwind. And I think that's such a powerful, fascinating thing. These tormented spirits are cycling around and around. They're in this sort of infernal subterranean wind. Think about that idea, that sort of image of the diaphanous wind. Okay, fast forward to this very powerful scene in the new Nosferatu, which is playing on this very, very old Victorian idea of the ghost, the vampire, the evil spirit appearing at night. And then Eggers is using all of the tropes, right? The billowing curtain, the blowing curtain, the shadow, which is a projection. So think about the most iconic image from Nosferatu, which is a story that has now been with us for 102 years in various incarnations. And also, Eggers has also had the female character levitating in this scene, right? So this whole idea of somebody who is possessed by satanic or infernal love, not only are they levitating, but the demonic specter is appearing as a shadow on a billowing curtain. It's all there. So, in thinking about the idea or the theme or the archetype of the phantom lover, I wanted to kind of give you a whole sort of grab bag of ideas to work with, things to think through, because I think that everything I've shown you is useful. If you're thinking about this idea of the phantom lover, not only in relationship to pop culture, but in relationship to sort of what undergirds it, right? Um, and so I want to talk about three specific forms of the phantom lover in relationship to this idea of the femme fatale, right? And so first we're going to talk about the eidolon, which is where our word idol comes from, that comes out of the classical archaic Greek tradition. And then we're going to be talking about also the yūrei, these sort of female phantoms, these vengeful female ghosts that are found in the pre-modern traditions of Japan. And there's more nuance there, which we're going to get to. And then we're going to end by talking about the succubus, which is this idea of the oppressive, sort of female demon that comes to us out of the Christian Middle Ages. So first, the eidolon in ancient Greece. What the heck is an eidolon? The eidolon is a phantom double, but it also can be, in earlier literature, interpreted as another way of talking about the soul or the ghost of a deceased person. So in the Iliad and the Odyssey, there are references made to the souls of the deceased, and they're called eidolons. So, case in point, here's a fresco in an Etruscan tomb showing the phantom eidolon or soul of Patroclus, and the eidolon of the dead Patroclus is shown on the left hand side, and so that's the spirit. Then his corpse is lying there, supine at the bottom of the painting. And that ghostly figure is standing next to a winged entity called Vanth, who's the Etruscan goddess of death. Okay, that's one of the oldest images that we have of the soul, at least in this tradition. And in the literature, his soul is referred to as an eidolon, right? And I think that term is also used when Odysseus makes his descent into the underworld. So in a lot of this ancient literature, that term eidolon can be used interchangeably with the word psyche for the soul of the departed. But it gets much more interesting when we get into some of this other literature related to this idea of the phantom lover. So eidolon is also this very strange phantom double that shows up in two really important myths. One is the myth of Ixion and Nephele. So in the story, Zeus is testing this mortal king Ixion, who has the hots for Hera. And what Zeus does is he creates a phantom double of Hera out of cloud. The gods, when they create these doubles, we're going to talk about the eidolon of Helen in just a minute, very often fashion them out of cloud. It's a really wonderful image. So here's an image that comes to us from the 17th century of King Ixion failing the test because he indeed tries to go for it with Hera. But remember, it's the decoy, right? It's the double of Hera that Zeus has created to test him. So an image for you again from the 17th century, and then another image from the Baroque period of bad King Ixion trying to get it on with Hera, queen of the gods, not knowing that it's actually a cloudy double. Well, what is Ixion's punishment? He is tied to a flaming wheel in Hades after he dies, and that is cranked for all eternity. So it's interesting also if we're thinking about this idea of the phantom lover, this idea of lust when it overtakes us, and this idea of, like I was talking about, this idea of repetition, right? If we're thinking about the Tibetan hells, if we're sort of thinking about the soul which can't escape its own lust, I would argue that that's the image of Ixion's punishment. And I think a lot of the punishments, if you're thinking about Tantalus in the underworld, where we get our term tantalized from, the punishments of these wicked people in Hades very often are representative of the sort of phenomenological feelings of human beings enthralled to their particular lusts that they can't control. So let's talk about the most important eidolon, phantom lover, in all of the Greek tradition. And that is, of course, the idea that Helen of Troy, the one who is actually taken, kidnapped, and becomes, the lover of Paris, is not the true Helen. The real Helen actually goes away to Egypt, and her sort of dignity is preserved. And it is an eidolon that is actually taken by the Greeks when Troy is invaded. So we get that idea out of the writings of Euripides. So here is a quote for you from the classicist Donna Zuckerberg. In the prologue of Euripides' Helen, Helen tells the audience that Hera created from the sky a breathing phantom for the son of King Priam. Helen also says that Hera created from the wind Helen's marriage to Paris. Very, very interesting. Helen's eidolon is an airy phantom, but it is not a mere hologram. It breathes and speaks. The clear implication is that it also has sex. It is touchable and it's interactive, right? So it's a replicant, in the way of thinking, if we're thinking about sort of the science fiction literature of Blade Runner, do androids dream of electric sheep, right? It's indistinguishable from the real thing. The fact that it is a phantom seems virtually undetectable until the moment it disappears much later in Euripides' play. So again, there's been also a lot of crossover, and I've certainly brought this up in my History of Robots course, and I also talk about it in my femme fatale classes. This idea of this very powerful female creature that plays the role of the temptress, that plays the role of the tester in a lot of this literature. She's more than human or less than human. And in the case of Helen of Troy, she's a copy. So there's a whole book written about this called Helen of Troy and Her Shameless Phantom by the classicist Norman Austin, which really does a deep dive into this and gets into the various nuances of how that Greek word eidolon and the idea of the copy or the replica of something shows up in a lot of the Greek literature. and what the ramifications are for that. If we're thinking about a lot of these ideas also in relationship to art, right? So, of course, the beauty of Helen of Troy is supernatural because if you remember the mythology of Helen of Troy, her mother is Leda, who is seduced by the swan, who is really Zeus in the form of the swan. So Helen and Clytemnestra and Castor and Pollux are sort of, they're the double twins that come forth from the two eggs that Leda lays. Um, and Helen and Clytemnestra, and then Castor and Pollux, and I forget who is who and what is what, but they are almost in a kind of Jungian way. One is mortal, one is immortal, right? So, well, always a lot to unpack. And because there's so much ambiguity about the meaning of this stuff, artists, psychologists, mythographers, writers, everyone has a field day with this over the centuries. So, again, because Helen of Troy is a supernatural beauty, and because this idea also that is she an eidolon? Is she the real deal? Her supernatural beauty, is an incredibly important theme for artists. So I wanted to put up three paintings of Helen of Troy that come out of the 19th century. One by the symbolist painter Gustave Moreau, one by Lord Leighton, and then one by the late sort of pre-Raphaelite, although she's kind of separate from them, Evelyn de Morgan, one of my favorite painters from the late Victorian, early 20th century period. But Helen of Troy is phantom-like or demigoddess-like in all of these, right? She glows. And there's also this idea found in the etymology of the name Helen, Elena, which may go back to the idea or a word for glowing or light. And that's something else which we'll talk more about in the fairy class. And this is even true when we get into the Japanese, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Within the words that are used to describe these female phantoms, the words often go back to words for something luminous. So there is the idea that the object of adoration, whether it's a phantom, a ghost, a goddess, a fairy, whatever, is because she glows. So this myth of the Egyptian Helen, the real Helen being taken down to Egypt while her eidolon is left in Troy, Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal had a field day creating an opera called The Egyptian Helen, which I saw many years ago and which is quite fun. It premiered in 1928. So even though the idea of the eidolon isn't, it does come up, there's a lot of other sort of supernatural shenanigans which make for a lot of fun. And it has a lot to do with sort of mistaken identity, this idea of love is illusion. So if there are any opera fans out there who haven't heard of this, Richard Strauss's music is so sumptuous anyway. But it's a very, very quirky, interesting take on this idea of who Helen of Troy was, but more importantly, all of the craziness that ensues, particularly in the menfolk, if we sort of dive into the story and make it more of a sort of a comic romance. So again, before we leave this eidolon of Helen of Troy, another manifestation that's really important in this history of the phantom lover in sort of the Western Romantic tradition is the story of Faust. Both Goethe's Faust and in the earlier tradition of Christopher Marlowe writing Dr. Faustus. So some images for you. Helen of Troy shows up as an eidolon in Faust, but there's this weird juxtaposition of the mortal woman that Faust is in lust with, and that's Gretchen or Marguerite. So, because remember, Mephistopheles is always sort of tricking Faust or showing him these visions, right? So again, this idea of eros, luxuria, being tied into sort of satanic temptation, because it has to do with the uncontrollable appetites. Mephistopheles is often sort of showing Faust these visions. So some images for you from the 19th century of Mephistopheles showing Faust Gretchen or Marguerite. She appears in sort of ghostly form. Um, and, again, when artists are illustrating this, because remember, of course, this is Goethe's enormous poem play. So very often we're dealing with images that are being printed. They're lithographs, they're etchings. Although sometimes there's also paintings done on this theme too. Um, Gretchen, Marguerite, and then later Helen glow. They're glowing. Case in point, when the Helen of Troy portion of Faust is imaged, she really, really is luminous. Um, Now, if you haven't seen this, I want to point this out. There's a very quirky film done in 1970, directed and starring Richard Burton and also Elizabeth Taylor, which is a film adaptation of Dr. Faustus by Marlowe. And, it's that period where Liz Taylor in the 60s and early 70s is doing the most out there, high camp Gothic stuff. It's really delicious and just bonkers. And so she's appearing as Helen of Troy and then later as this sort of satanic demoness, just in all of these vignettes. And she's absolutely gorgeous. And the costume designers are just have a field day with the hairdressing and with the costumes. So I want to put that up for you because that's a part of this sort of tradition of the eidolon of Helen of Troy. Two more images, one from Murnau's 1926 Faust, where the Gretchen Helen figure appears in the nude. Her breasts are exposed, but she's draped, looking like a classical goddess. And then from another adaptation of the Faust story, in which both the Gretchen Marguerite figure and Helen of Troy play a prominent role, and that is Arrigo Boito's Mephistopheles. So an image for you here from a 2013 production of the opera. So let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about the yūrei. And again, when we do the femme fatale class, we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into this. But there is such a strong, exquisite tradition of the female ghost or the female spirit who has some kind of an erotic interchange with a man. Sometimes, as we'll talk about the snow woman in a minute, it's more fairy-like, it's more elemental-like, it's more goddess-like. But in a lot of situations, sort of we're thinking about the yokai tradition, which is sort of all of the spirits of Japan. Um, it's a very, very prominent, powerful theme. So again, I'm going to be using some of these terms. I'm going to try to be careful here as I use these terms, because of course the yokai is the word for the sort of larger category of phantoms, ghosts, and spirits, and the yūrei are are ghosts that can be male or female. And then we're going to get even more specific in a minute when we talk about sort of vengeful female ghosts. But for our purposes, let's talk about sort of the ghost writ large. So there are many different types of yūrei. In most cases, how they appear depends on the circumstances of their death, right? Because again, if we're thinking about the tradition of the ghost or the phantom that haunts, it very often does have to do with unfinished business. And so if we're thinking about this Japanese tradition, they can very often appear with the wounds of how they died, and sometimes they appear without having feet. They're hovering. So I want to talk about a sort of a subgroup of these, and that's the onryo. And you have to forgive my pronunciation. This is not my field of expertise, although I am a great lover of Edo period ghost literature and particularly art. But let's talk a little bit about the vengeful female spirit, because again, if we're thinking about this idea of the phantom lover, this is a very, very prominent thing, not only in the folklore of Japan, but specifically in the period of Edo in the 19th century. So let's talk a little bit about the Phantom Bride, and this comes to us from this kabuki play, the Yotsuya Kaidan. So Oiwa is a faithful wife, and she's betrayed by her husband, who poisons her to take another woman. Now the poison disfigures her, and she returns as this disfigured ghost, and to drive him to insanity. And in certain versions of this, there's a much more erotic element. So I wanted to put that up for you because in a little bit I'm going to be showing you some erotic images because there is a whole sort of literature where these sort of stories of vengeful female ghosts and vengeful hungry ghosts become sort of downright pornographic. So an image for you, a woodblock print of this story. Um, these folk tales are very often become, very important sort of in the literature, both of kabuki plays or also of, they're being written down and they're becoming novels, right? Oh, another really wonderful one, The Vengeful Courtesan. Okiku is a beautiful servant who rejects the advances of her samurai. And so, to get back at her, he tricks her into thinking she has lost one of his family heirloom plates. And of course, because of the way the system of power is set up, that can be punishable by death. And so he throws her down a well. And so there's all of these images of her, vengeful ghosts returning, and very often the plates are a part of the way that the ghost is imaged. So there's this really, really beautiful image by Hokusai from his 100 Ghosts showing her vengeful spirit coming back up, out of the well, drawing the plates behind it. I think that's really, really marvelous. So that's the tradition of sort of the phantom lover, female ghosts coming out of this tradition. And something similar where the figure is not so much a ghost as she is like a fairy figure, right? Let's talk a little bit about the snow woman, the Yuki Onna. And this has really been popularized both in Japan, but also in sort of the romantic, orientalized Japonismo literature of the West because of a person named Lafcadio Hearn. And he's really, really important because he is a Westerner who lived all over the place, but then went to live in Japan, married a Japanese woman, collected a lot of these folk tales, and translated them. And what we see in this period, and it's something that you'll actually see also in the way that Edgar Allan Poe circulates first in France, becomes popular again in America, then the Japanese discover him. There's this really sort of wonderful circulation of erotic Gothic ghost literature in the 19th and the early 20th century between Japan, between France, and also the Gothic Romanticism of the United States. We'll talk more about that in the Femme Fatale class. Okay, so the Snow Woman comes out of this sort of interesting nexus of Japan, America, and then also the Gothic French stuff too. And again, we'll talk more about that when I teach the class. So what's the story of the Snow Woman? Well, the story of the Snow Woman partakes in this sort of trope of the broken oath. So there's a wandering traveler. He's caught in a snowstorm. He meets this beautiful woman. She's pale. She's almost transparent. Think about back to this idea of the fairy wife. She falls in love with him, but she warns that he can't ever tell anybody about their relationship. Of course, he does. And of course, she appears and then she disappears, and there's all kinds of dire things that ensue. This is a trope, like the one forbidden thing, right? So you break the oath, and because you've broken the oath to the supernatural lover or spouse that you've made the pact with, the story ends tragically. So the Snow Woman is a very important part of the anthology film Kwaidan, um, uh, directed in 1964 by Masaki Kobayashi. And if you haven't seen it, I would urge you to see it. One of the most exquisite Japanese films, absolutely ravishing and beautiful. And it's several short films, which are based on the Japanese folk tales that appear in that Lafcadio Hearn collection that I just told you about. So a wonderful way that these stories have circulated and the way that they have been received in different cultures and then found their way back. And really, really kind of a lovely story about how cultural appropriation can also be cultural circulation, right? And the ways that it can be augmented, appreciated, protected, returned. It creates sort of a much more complicated story of circulation, I think. So again, I've mentioned also that this yūrei literature is a part of this, and certainly you see this in manga and in later 20th and 20th century um, ways that these folktales are used in cinema and manga and all these other um, contemporary, right, Japanese and American sort of takes on the folkloric traditions of Japan. So erotic horror, right? So Kuniyoshi did a whole series that come out of the Night Procession of the Hundred Demons, which are just downright sexual. Great fun, where the ghosts and the phantoms haunting the human beings take on the form of genitalia. So some really, really fun images for you here. And these are from way back. These are from 1830. Um, and of course, these are all available online if you want to go through them and if you want to know more about the particular stories and myths and references that they're connected to. So, the last sort of representation of the Phantom Lover that I want to talk about tonight. So, we talked about the eidolon, we talked about the yūrei, and now I want to talk a little bit about the succubus, uh, which is the female version of the incubus. The succubus is something that comes out of the medieval and Renaissance literature of the Catholic Church, and that will later tie into the witch hunting. And if you come take my witch class in the fall, we're going to talk a lot more about this. So, folklorically speaking, this idea of the female demon that sucks the life energy out of a man or sometimes a woman. The life energy can be, just the energy. It can be the breath. It can be semen. It can be blood. It can be whatever, right? But there's some vital essence, whether physical or metaphysical, that this demon figure is extracting from the human being. And in the case of the incubus and the succubus, very often it's not just the life force, but it can be the sexual potency or sometimes the sexual fluid. So this idea is set down in print in the Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous witch hunting manual that's written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, who's a Dominican inquisitor. So here's a quote from it. Devils, through the operation of incubi, so the male version, and succubi, female version, can take human seed, semen, transport it elsewhere, and use it to generate offspring. This is done with God's permission as punishment for sins, and such children are said to be notably strong and cunning. So there was this idea in the Middle Ages, and there are other Catholic writers who counter this and say, no, that's not possible. For example, King James, who was a witch hunter himself and wrote a lot about the occult and different types of demons in his demonology. Again, we'll talk more about that in the fairies class and in the witches class. He doesn't believe this can be true. But for our purposes here, there are people in the church who do believe that an incubus can attack a man at night, extract the semen from his body, through a wet dream or whatever, and then find a woman and implant it in her. So the demon would first appear as a succubus, extract the semen, then appear as an incubus and inject it into a woman and conceive. So thinking back to the idea of the conception of Merlin and then to Rosemary's Baby, there are Christian writers in the 15th century and a little bit earlier who are trying to figure this out mechanically, right? How does this actually work? So that comes out of the witch's hammer. I wanted to put up an image for you of from Dürer, Albrecht Dürer, because, and we'll see this again in the witches class that I'm going to be teaching, the image of the witch as a seductress, particularly, wearing some kind of a fabulous headdress, flying drapery, but being totally nude. You're going to see that a lot in this Renaissance, early modern visualization of these sensual witches. So here's an example of that from 1487. So this is just, 1497. This is just 10 years after the Hammer of the Witches is published. So Dürer and Hans Baldung and a lot of these other artists of the time are creating images of the sensual witch, which is a match for this thing, the succubus, and sometimes they're interchangeable as we go along here. The idea of the succubus certainly has connections to Lilith and to a lot of these older female demons and demigoddesses and night hags that come out of the Near Eastern tradition. That's a very, very tangled, complicated history. Um, and we'll talk more about that in the fairy class and also the witches class. But of course, I had to put up this beautiful image of Lilith from 1994. It's a bronze, which is actually attached to a wall by the American artist Kiki Smith. The eyes are glass. I saw this in person a few years ago in New York. It was installed in the stairway, I think, at the Met or maybe the MoMA in New York. So I was coming down the staircase. I ran into it. You know, it's hooked to the wall. I didn't literally run into it, but it was there in front of me, and it is deeply disturbing and absolutely gorgeous, and just so appropriately designed to be hooked into the wall there, right? So again, if you're thinking about this idea of, why was Lilith condemned in the Talmud? Because she would not lie under Adam. So there's this idea that the succubus, the female demon, lies on top of you. And Kiki Smith is certainly playing with this in her version of it because she's got Lilith literally made out of bronze and literally attached to a wall, staring at you with her glass eyes. Fantastic, fantastic representation. Okay, so that having been said, we have to remember that the succubus is the inversion or the female version of the incubus. So two images for you from the Romantic period, Henri Fuseli's The Nightmare from 1781, and also the incubus leaving two young women from 1793. So Fuseli, early modern, excuse me, not early modern, but early romantic artist, is really obsessed with this idea of the thing that oppresses you by night, the nightmare. He's talking about the incubus, but the succubus is the female version of this, right? So coming into being in the late medieval, early modern period in the literature, it's sort of there in the folklore, thinking back to the birth of Merlin. But then the romantics are really having a field day with it because they become so obsessed with this idea of erotic dreams, right? Um, and sort of reviving this idea. A lot of the stuff that's in the witch folklore, the romantics are using it for their own purposes, right? Hundreds of years later. Again, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the succubus is also dovetailing with this idea of the femme fatale as the female presence. We're going to talk more about this in my femme fatale class, as the thing that extracts the juice or the power from the male, right? So this image from 1915 by Fritz Schwimbeck, My Bad Dream, where the succubus is being seen almost like a harpy lying on top of him. And then Philip Burne-Jones from 1897 doing this image of the vampire. And another one of the archetypes that we're going to be looking at in the Femme Fatale 2 class, actually the first one we're going to be looking at, is the vamp. So this idea in the late 19th, early 20th century, the vamp, the sexually available, wicked, canny female leading men astray, sucking the life force out of them. Very often she's a courtesan. Sometimes she's an actress. Sometimes, she takes on many, many forms in the culture. She has a very strong connection to this older tradition of the succubus. A lot of other femme fatale figures, the siren, the sphinx, right, the chimera. But she's also, quite simply, the woman on top. And so you see that here in this image by Philip Burne-Jones. And again, thinking about women being on top, that's literally the crime of Lilith if we go back to the earlier story. She will not lie under Adam. So the succubus, the femme fatale, the vamp, we're going to be talking a lot about that in the full class. So I want to end with this image, thinking about just that thing. Here's Theda Bara in A Fool There Was, the first great cinematic vamp, again, lying on top of her male victim. And then if you think back to the Dracula imagery, whether you're talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula or any of the many films, think about the brides of Dracula. Think about, particularly in the Coppola film from 92, there are these exquisite, gorgeous, exoticized, orientalized, ravishing Byzantine femme fatales, but they're also bloodsuckers, right? And they're coming up out of the bed and they're taking over Jonathan Harker. So again, when we get to the full course, we're going to see how this idea of the phantom lover, this idea of the succubus, this idea of the vamp, these things come together in many, many interesting ways. And we're going to be teasing those things apart and putting them back together. So thank you so much for coming on this journey with me this evening. I know it's been a lot of information. That was my take on this idea of the phantom lover. And so just to recap again, the Femme Fatale class is going to be looking at mostly the 19th and the early 20th century, but we're definitely going to be visiting other cultures. We're also going to be looking at the antecedent literature. Because all of these things are so important as we try to sort of unpack these various femme fatale figures, and as we try to understand all the different cultural streams that have fed into them, and as we try to really think about also how these femme fatales can be reclaimed and how they can be creative ways, as it were, to our own empowerment, whether we're male, female, whatever our gender, whatever our story. And I think that's a very, very important part of the work that we do as creative people, as historians, and as human beings that are just interested in learning more about these things. So thank you so much again for coming with me on this journey, and I hope I will see some of you, if not in the Femme Fatale class, then certainly in the fairies class or in the witches class or in any of the classes that I'm going to be teaching through morbid anatomy. Thanks again so much for your time this evening. Have a great rest of the night and take good care.